there's something rotten in Denmark here. Something nasty is going on.
Just a vicious circle.
With each, successive investigation, the picture seemed to get even more complicated and confusing.
These people had been ordered not to grant me an interview.
Somebody didn't want that dig dug.
In 1959, Louis Leakey and his wife Mary changed the vision of the world when they discovered the remains of an ancestral human who lived in Africa almost 2 million years ago. At Olduvai, Leakey discovered fossilized bone with chipped stones that proved human toolmaking extended back to an unbelievably distant past. The Leakeys got an age range of around 1.1 million years when they used an experimental dating method. Fission track dating was a new technique that tested radioactive decay in mineral crystals found in the layers of lava and volcanic ash overlying the bones and artifacts. In the same year, perhaps even the same field season, one of the great coincidences in archaeological science occurred on the other side of the globe. In 1959, Juan Armenta Camacho, a gifted amateur, discovered stone artifacts and fossilized animal bones that were eroding from the banks of an old lake bed in central Mexico. The finds from Africa and Mexico share many similarities, but the story of what happened with each discovery is one of the most dramatically different parallels in the history of archaeology. While Leakey's finds were embraced as confirmation of man's origins in Africa, Armenta's discovery ignited a firestorm of controversy about man's first occurrence in the New World, and a suppression of evidence that continues to this day. Near the city of Puebla, about 70 miles southeast of Mexico City, a number of ancient volcanoes rise from the central plateau. The region was known to the Aztecs as the Land of Giants. When the Spanish began digging their foundations for their 17th century cathedrals, they had unearthed the bones of large mammals unlike anything they had ever seen. By the 1950s, paleontologists had known for decades that the shores of the Valsequillo Reservoir were a rich source of Pleistocene fossils, the bones of large mammals that had lived in the region long ago but became extinct at the end of the last ice age. During the field season in 1959, Juan Armenta Camacho found the artifact that launched one of the New World's most controversial scientific mysteries. As he began to clean a fragment from an ancient mastodon bone, he discovered artwork. He saw the engraved images of several different animals that lived during the last ice age. Heads of a feline, serpent, and mastodon, as well as hunting scenes, were all executed with extraordinary artistic capability. One image is thought to be a tapir, a sort of pig, being brought down by spears. This elephant-type creature has been identified as a gomphothere, a relative of the mastodon. Unlike its later descendant, the elephant, it has 4 straight tusks. This may be the only representation of its kind ever found. In another engraving, Chris Hardiker recognized what he thought was the elegant depiction of a horse. It was possible that Armenta had uncovered some of the oldest human artifacts, and probably the oldest art ever discovered in the New World. At the time he found it, Armenta knew what a good scientist should do. He kept the artifact a secret, but began to invite preeminent specialists to verify the discovery. Microscopic studies of the engraving showed that the bone had been engraved when it was still fresh, what the paleontologists call green bone. This indicated that the artist worked soon after the animal was killed, and the artifact was not a recently drawn fake. But how old was it? In 1926, J.D. Figgins made a breakthrough in American archaeology. He proved that humans had lived in the New World during the Ice Age, the time of the giant mammals. At a site in Folsom, New Mexico, he discovered a man-made spear point among the bones of an extinct bison antiques. At the time, scientists believed that humans first arrived in the New World about 4,000 years ago. But with this new discovery, the date was pushed back to somewhere between 20 and 500,000 years. In 1926, no one knew when the Ice Age actually occurred. It was not until Willard Libby developed the technology of radiocarbon dating that scientists could determine that the last Ice Age and its megafauna started to vanish around 14,000 years ago. In the late 1950s, the new carbon dating technique was gaining wide acceptance, but Armenta quickly realized that he could not use it. His artifacts had been in the ground for so long that their chemical composition had changed from organic bone material to mineralized fossil, which contained no carbon compounds that could be tested by radiocarbon dating. Armenta immediately recognized the potential significance of his find. The stakes were high, and he knew he must proceed carefully. He invited scientists from all over the world. One of the first on the scene was famed Paleo-Indian archaeologist Dr. Hannah Marie Wormington. After examining the collection, she was convinced that the Valsequillo artifacts were an extremely important find. Meanwhile, word of the discovery leaked out to the press, and in the summer of 1960, Life magazine published a feature article about Armenta and his site. The now famous engraved mastodon bone was sent to the Smithsonian Institution for public display. However, it was soon returned to Mexico, and in a strange foreshadowing of events, seems to have become lost. As public interest in the site was growing, Armenta made another amazing discovery. In 1961, in the bottom of an arroyo, he found a spearhead. Nearby, still in situ in the bank, was an elephant jawbone with an obvious crack, into which the point fit perfectly. As Armenta describes the find,
the artifact was driven into the animal in life and was preserved in place for a long time, during which the bone developed scarring osteosis. In addition, the projectile caused fissure fractures, which radiate vertically from the point of maximum penetration, which reveals the tremendous force of the impact. My hypothesis is that men were hunting a mammoth, and though aiming for the throat, they missed. But the misfortune of the hunters was the great fortune of the prehistorians, as the projectile was driven into the edge of the mandible and the animal carried it in its escape, keeping it for the rest of its life.
Now, mammoths were supposed to have lived during the Ice Age and were extinct approximately 20,000 years ago. At the time that Juan found this, man was only supposed to have been in the New World for 10,000 years. So he thought he had good evidence, a smoking gun, essentially, of a doubling of age for man in the New World.
The Peabody Museum at Harvard had been in discussions for setting up an expedition at the time. The discovery of a man-made spear point embedded in the jawbone of an Ice Age mammal was like a carrot on a stick, and fieldwork began the following spring in 1962. On the same day the Life magazine article was published, Wormington wrote to her protege, Cynthia Irwin Williams, describing her impressions of the site and hinting at its potential significance. Wormington had always been a pioneer. When she began her studies in 1937, women were not yet allowed in the Department of Archaeology at Harvard. Undaunted, she sat outside on the steps of the lecture hall to take notes. Wormington began mentoring Irwin when Cynthia was a teenager. Cynthia's mother also had a strong interest in archaeology. Kay Irwin was an innovator in the casting of artifact reproductions. She specialized in adding the artistic touch of perfect color duplication when she recreated the flints, cherts, and other stone materials of the past. This skill would prove more important than anyone could have imagined as events unfolded. In the mid-1950s, Marie Wormington was writing her masterpiece, Ancient Man in North America. The fourth edition was the first major synthesis of paleo research to include the new radiocarbon dating method. To professionals and the public, she effectively communicated the idea that the record of paleo peoples in the New World began around 12,000 years ago. Wormington was optimistic that the new technologies would lead to further discovery. She knew that the Valsequillo site would require careful excavation, and her protege, Cynthia Irwin, was ready to lead the team. In 1962, Cynthia Irwin was 1 year shy of marriage and her Harvard PhD. She had already led several world-class digs. She was granted a permit from the Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, known as the INAH. Along with Juan Armenta, she began her first season at Hueatlaco, on the shores of the Valsequillo Reservoir.
She went down there for 3 years, 1962, 64, 66. She organized probably one of the first interdisciplinary archaeological expeditions, at least in Mexico, looking for early man in America during the Ice Age. Interdisciplinary means that it wasn't just an archaeologist going down looking for artifacts. She brought along Smithsonian paleontologists and geologists from the U.S. Geological Survey, the tops in their field.
The site, called Hueatlaco, was once the channel of an ancient stream. Cynthia chose a spot to excavate not far from where Armenta had discovered the engraved bones. The site turned productive very quickly. Stone spear points were uncovered, and Cynthia's team began to carefully record the positions where the artifacts were found.
The sites that were chosen all were productive, all had artifacts, and all were associated with Ice Age animals. So it was an incredible beginning in 1962.
Eventually turned out to be one of the most controversial sites that's been excavated, and one that we have not resolved the issues. The site is stratified. In other words, younger stuff's at the top, and you just dig on down through lower stuff. And these are casts of the artifacts, starting up here with the upper Hueatlaco Unit C is the youngest, and then this material down here from El Horno is the oldest. And that makes perfectly good sense, because this type of projectile point, it's bifacial, it's flaked on both sides, and it's bipointed. And to my way of thinking, this is an Asian style projectile point because it's very thick relative to its width, and it's pointed at both ends. And we can follow this style of projectile point all the way back into Siberia. But we see these in South America starting around 12,000, between 13 and 12,000. And so to find this at roughly that same age in the Valley of Mexico makes perfectly good sense.
One of the interesting parts about these spear points was that they did not have the customary flute that was essentially the earmark of Clovis points. So she knew she wasn't dealing with a Clovis culture here.
Beneath the volcanic layer, called the Hueatlaco ash, are deposits of clay. Beneath those layers are beds C and E, where Irwin Williams found bifacial spear points and Ice Age animal bones. Beneath that was bed I, where the older unifacial spear points were found.
So they started excavating down below, and then all of a sudden they started getting these very interesting flint artifacts. And these are projectile points that are unifacial. In other words, actually they're not even bifacial, they're just pieces of flint that have been shaped to a sharp point with these steep flakes coming all the way down here, all the way down there, and that's all they could do to make the artifact. And these were found with mammoth bones, with camels, with horse, all kinds of animals that are now extinct.
Cynthia personally excavated each artifact as it was found. The stratigraphy and the relative positions of the stone tools made sense to her. It is generally accepted that bifacial tools were more complex and the bifacial tradition more recent than simpler unifacial tools that would be found in the earlier, lower levels of geological time.
This led her to conclude that she had perhaps technological evolution occurring at this site. She had excellent bifaces on top, and she had unifaces on the bottom, all associated with extinct Ice Age animals. It couldn't have been better. The problem was dating. The bones were so fossilized, their organic materials had been replaced by minerals, preventing C14 from being used on these bones. There just wasn't enough organic material left to date.
Cynthia believed they needed to find another site, away from the edges of the water, where the bone might not have become fossilized as quickly.
So in 1966, Malde, the geologist, found about 3 or 4 miles away stratigraphy in a deep wash called Kalapan. He found some stratigraphy or a layer of soil that he thought was of the same age and of the same nature as the materials they were digging out at the reservoir.
Hal Malde found what he was looking for. In a layer of stratigraphy, which was identical to the stratum in which the artifacts were discovered, he found a shell that was not fossilized. Using the carbon-14 dating method on this shell from Kalapan, the age of 22,000 years was derived. As radical as it seemed, 22,000 years would eventually become the most conservative estimate for the arrival of early humans at Valsequillo.
As a matter of fact, if it's only 22,000 or 24,000, as she originally thought, that's really interesting too, because it's totally different than anything we're getting at that age as well. And it is much older than anything we have in North America right now, by at least 6,000 years.
This young graduate student has found probably the earliest site in the New World. Was she right? Was she correct? How did she feel about this? She was nervous. If anything, Cynthia was extremely responsible as a scientist. She didn't want to go grandstanding and go blabbing to the news. In fact, we have a letter where she's writing to the director of the Peabody Museum, a Dr. Brew, where she doesn't want to go public with this yet. She's feeling very uneasy about these dates because of their great antiquity.
Williams immediately knew that a 22,000-year date paralleled the oldest known spear points found in the Old World. This meant that if the spear points found at Hueatlaco were any lower in the strat column than Kalapan, she would have to face the unthinkable, that she had found the oldest spear points ever discovered in the New World. As controversial as this date was, it was nothing compared with what was yet to come. The release of the 22,000-year date triggered an avalanche of unexpected events. Dr. Jose Luis Lorenzo, head archaeologist at Mexico's National Museum, published a bulletin accusing Irwin Williams and Juan Armenta of planting their discoveries. Then, according to eyewitnesses, Lorenzo sent armed federales to the site to intimidate the workers, trying to elicit confessions that they planted the controversial spear points. Juan Armenta's daughter, Celine, remembers those days.
The scientific authorities sent some men with pistols to try to scare the workers at the field. And they were about 60 workers. But 3 of them accepted that the fossils were planted. And only these 3 people who signed the paper and saying, yes, we planted, and the scientists planted the fossils. The other 50 and more workers never accepted. They were very honest.
The people with the guns wanted the workers to say that the site was salted. What that means is that instead of digging the bones and the tools out from the sediments themselves, somebody planted them in the dirt and then dug them up and said, oh, we found them here.
Jose Lorenzo, who was the Mexican archaeologist, who's well known for his Paleo-Indian work, I think was a little jealous that, one, he didn't find that early stuff, two, that it was an American that found it, and three, it was an American woman that found it. And so he did everything he could to discredit Cynthia and the work.
I don't think she was directly accused of planting the artifacts herself. Instead, it may have been something much worse, that she was incompetent to realize that artifacts were being planted on her site. These sites were all very hard sediments. They were not dirt like you usually see archaeologists digging in your science films. Consider a sidewalk. If you're trying to convince an archaeologist that something in that sidewalk has been planted, this means you got to break open that sidewalk and try and cover it up. Having worked down there last year and experienced the density and the hardness of the sediments, both the Mexican archaeologists and myself agreed there's just no way you could plant artifacts in this material and hope to get away with it.
Marie Wormington quickly moved to her protege's defense. In the fall, she organized a professional conference, essentially to defend Cynthia against the claims of fraud. The archaeological professionals closed ranks behind Cynthia, confirming the validity of her excavation work.
She was one of the greats in instituting new techniques, new scientific techniques for recovering the most minute detail. And this was one of the wonderful elements she brought to her profession and why she was so highly regarded for her entire life.
They owned the artifacts. She was working under a permit that these artifacts belonged to the Museo Nacional in Mexico City, where some of them worked. And so when she left, she deposited these along with the bone at the museum. And when she went back to study them, they were all gone. And they've never been seen since. Now, fortunately for all of us, her mother was with her, and while she was in Mexico, she cast those artifacts before they were given back to the museum. And when she died, her collection came here. And so this is all that is left of that excavation, is what's these plastic artifacts in this box. So right now, the important thing is Cynthia's now passed away, as have the archaeologists in Mexico that were basically jealous of her finding this real early stuff. And so now it's time to go back and reassess what actually went on there.
In spite of the support Irwin Williams received from Wormington and her peers, the controversy about the artifacts was soon to escalate when new dating techniques were applied. In an attempt to accurately determine the age of the volcanic ash, 2 geologists from the United States Geological Survey were brought in. Barney Szabo ran tests using uranium series dating, while Virginia Steen McIntyre examined mineral crystals using her expertise in tephrochronology. No one was prepared for the shock when Barney Szabo announced a uranium series age of 250,000 years old.
We dated the strata at 250,000 years, 250,000 years, which was more than 10 times older than they thought they should be.
At this point, Irwin Williams went from potentially making history for redating the arrival of man in the New World to facing dates that were so extreme she felt they could not be published at all. But more importantly, she was denied permission to ever work at the site again. Her official report was never completed. All of the artifacts have gone missing, and the site was closed to further investigation. The story of Irwin Williams and Armenta's historic discoveries has almost been forgotten, as the memory of the scientific uproar of Valsequillo has faded away. 40 years have passed, but although many prominent archaeologists still believe that the Valsequillo site contains important evidence, It took one man's vision and tenacity to reignite the investigation.
So we need a breakthrough site like way at Laco, which just jumps you back here. And then you've got to start rethinking and reconstructing everything.
In 1997, George Carter, an archaeologist with a long career of investigating controversial cases, called upon his friend Marshall Payne to reopen the Valsequillo site and to underwrite a new series of field tests.
And then they said, well, how'd you get interested in Way at Laco? I says, well, George Carter called me one time and asked me if I wouldn't look into that. And he says something like, what are you going to do next time? I says, I'm not answering the phone.
Historically, many of the great advances in American science have begun with the entrepreneurial dreams of financial patrons from outside the profession. For example, today's most widely held theory for the peopling of the New World across Beringia was advanced at the beginning of the 20th century by collaboration between science and private philanthropic support. Franz Boas from the American Museum of Natural History launched teams of anthropological researchers into Alaska and Siberia. The expedition was underwritten by a New York financier by the name of Morris K. Jessup. Boas's scientific vision, financed privately by Jessup, became a foundation block for the emerging hypothesis that the first Americans came from Siberia. Similarly, in 2001, a new archaeological expedition combining Mexican and U.S. scientists was organized to go to Valsequillo and reassess the results of Cynthia Irwin's earlier work. This new research was funded entirely by Marshall Payne.
What I intended to do is to redo what was done many years ago by Cynthia Irwin Williams, but to use more modern techniques in the evaluation of what was done.
Most scientists accepted that the artifacts were real. It was the age of the site that ultimately created the greatest controversy. The new research team devoted itself to reanalyzing the entire sequence of dating events. In 1968, a new and still experimental dating method was used directly on the bones that Cynthia found with the tools. Charles Naser, a dating specialist with the U.S. Geological Survey, joined the effort.
The dating of this site started off when geologists working with anthropologists collected bones from large mammals that were associated in the same layer as the artifact tools. These bones were given to Barney Szabo at the USGS in Denver. He was involved with a technique called uranium series disequilibrium dating.
As uranium decays by alpha emission, new daughter elements, such as thorium-234, are created. This process continues over time, with both elements accumulating. By measuring the amounts of the new daughter elements and comparing it to the amount of uranium that was present, an age can be calculated.
So we don't know what the top end on a lot of Barney's ages were, but we know that they were certainly greater than 100,000 years.
So this was a bombshell.
100,000 years was far earlier than most scientists believe the first humans would have been capable of reaching the New World from Asia. The uranium dating of the bones was just one of the tests using new dating techniques. In 1966, Virginia Steen McIntyre joined the team. McIntyre was a young graduate student who specialized in the new technologies used to date layers of volcanic ash. The different layers of ash, or tephras, were the result of different volcanic eruptions over time. If geologists could calculate the date of the volcanic eruption by analyzing the ash layer, they would then know that the tools found below the tephra were even older. McIntyre used an experimental dating method that calculated the trace elements of water trapped in crystals that formed with the ash.
That's a piece of pumice. Lightweight. Probably would float on water. Little tiny crystals in there, crystals that I work with. So small, they're smaller than grains of sand.
Although her method at the time was very experimental, she too got an age in the range of 250,000 years, far too early for the accepted dates of humans in the New World.
Changing the date of the age of man in the New World from 10,000 to 20,000 would have been just great. It would have made all of us that worked on the site heroes. But to go from 10 to 250,000, it was just too much for most people.
This led to further testing of the volcanic ash layers.
Fission track dating relies on a very rare event that happens to uranium atoms.
When a volcano erupts, it forms zircon crystals and volcanic glass, in which are trapped uranium-238 atoms. The uranium spontaneously decays, releasing energy when splitting into two roughly equal nuclei. These highly charged particles repel each other and shoot off in opposite directions with great force. They leave behind damage scars or fission tracks in the mineral. Because the radioactive decay occurs at a known rate, the density of fission tracks can be compared to the amount of uranium within a mineral grain to determine its age.
My ages came out on two different samples of about 400,000 years and about 600,000 years. They could not have been 10,000 or 15,000.
What happened to these findings of yours?
It appears that it just went off into a black hole. The data never ever gets cited. Nobody ever talks to me about it. It's just as if we had never done it.
Well, we have it in Cynthia's own writing that those radical dates are not to be used because they're too unreliable. What would be your comment?
At the time that this work was begun, they were relatively new, but they had been well tested in the geological literature, and geologists accepted their results as valid.
So how surprising is this, Chuck? Didn't you tell me that you were involved in the Olduvai discoveries in Africa with your dating?
About the same time, I got involved with dating zircons from the Olduvai site, and it pretty well settled that early man had been in Africa for at least 1.8 to 2 million years.
The discoveries at Olduvai and Valsequillo were made in the same year, and both were dated using fission track dating, conducted by the same expert, Charles Nasser of the U.S. Geological Survey. The African site changed human history, but the Mexican site was ignored and virtually forgotten. The question is, why?
Of course, when I was a graduate student growing up, I was taught that Clovis was the earliest period. So we were looking at 11,005, maybe 12,000 years ago. Now we're pushing it back, of course, to the 15,000s. But certainly, I don't think there is a living archaeologist that would ever hold to the idea that people were here 200 or so thousand years ago. So what we have is not a dilemma, but what I've always called in my teaching a trilemma, a triangle. Any two of these components can be true. Cynthia can be right, and the dating can be right. An archaeological theory about the origin of people in the New World is wrong. The origin of people in the New World is right, and the dating is right, and therefore Cynthia Irwin Williams was wrong. Or Cynthia Irwin Williams is right, the origin and development of population in the New World is right, and the dating is wrong. Well, I just don't see how you can deal with that, because the dating was done by tephrochronologists that I respect and understand. The archaeology was done by archaeologists that I respect and understand. And as a practicing archaeologist, I am not going to go against archaeological method and theory that's stating basically that people had to come in somewhere after maybe 30,000 years ago. So this is a completely fascinating, completely aggravating, completely wonderful site to teach about. Because, as I said, any two can be right, but not all three. And so something, at some point, is going to have to give.
Which leg of the trilemma should be revised? The geochronology, the archaeology, or the theory of man's arrival in the New World? Marshall Payne decided to first re-examine the geochronology of the volcanic ash to find out if it was indeed 250,000 years old. He began the process by sending the original Hueatlaco reports to several geologists.
And back came the reports, and they all said the same thing. They said that the geology looks sound, but if you really want to be certain about this, you should use techniques that are available today that were not available 30 years ago. So we gathered a couple of 100 pounds of that material, and the Mexicans shipped that material to Caltech, to a man named Ken Farley, who is the originator and the expert on another dating system used in geology called uranium, thorium, helium dating.
This would be the first time the uranium, thorium, helium method would be used in archaeology. Dr. Farley's results were even more astounding than what Marshall expected.
Uranium, thorium, helium dating is a very old idea. It goes back to the discovery of the alpha particle, the first particle discovered to be a radioactive product. It's based on the idea that when uranium decays, it produces alpha particles at a known rate, and by measuring the amount of alpha particles that are present in a crystal, one can establish how long it's been since the helium began to accumulate in that crystal. And the advantage of the uranium, thorium, helium system relative to the fission track system is that there are a lot more alpha particles produced than there are fission tracks produced, and so you get a much larger signal, which is important when one is trying to date very young samples. So I was sent zircon separates, which I analyzed here in my lab, heating these crystals to 1300 degrees C with a laser or with a resistance furnace. The helium comes out of the crystals at that temperature by diffusion. We then retrieve the crystals from the vacuum furnace after the helium is analyzed, retrieve them from the furnace, dissolve them, and analyze them for uranium and thorium by inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry.
I exacted blood oath promises from these scientists that they would not communicate with each other until I had their results in my hand. And they agreed to do this, and in fact, that's what they did.
The zircon crystals were sent to me blind. All I was told was that the crystals were likely to be young, analyzed the samples, produced an age which was between 400 and 500,000 years. People are free to believe what they want to believe, but the technique I use is based on extremely well-established physical principles, and if you disbelieve the physical principles on which it's based, that's not science.
Leg 1 of the trilemma, the geochronology, says the stratum above the artifacts could be as old as 500,000 years. The next question is, has the correlation between the Hueatlaco ash and the artifacts been properly identified? It's time to examine the second leg of the trilemma, the archaeology. Throughout the years Cynthia was excavating, her team developed a geological model that showed that all the levels of accumulated sediment were laid down successively on top of one another, like a layer cake. All the artifacts and associated bones were excavated from strata below the Hueatlaco ash. The more advanced bifacial tools were found in beds C and E, while the older, more primitive unifacials were found in bed I. But was this interpretation of the stratigraphy correct? Geologist Hal Malde went back to the site to retest the stratigraphy.
The bottom line on this is that we were trying to determine whether there was continuity from the place where Cynthia had excavated in the 60s and the uppermost part of the exposed geology. And in fact, that was the result. We found that it was layer after layer after layer with no interruption, no discontinuities, no places where there was any downcutting, a simple set of individual units, one on top of the other, from where Cynthia had dug all the way up to the top of the section.
In the first leg of the trilemma, The geochronology says the age of the Hueyatlaco ash was at least 250,000 years old, and some tests said it was much older. The second leg, the archaeology, bears out that the artifacts appear to have been found in a sequence of strata, which is entirely overlaid by the Hueyatlaco ash. If these two legs of the trilemma are correct, this means that modern bifacial spear points were made in the New World 250,000 years ago. It's time to examine the third leg of the trilemma, the theory of man's arrival in the Americas. According to the prevailing archaeological model, modern man occupied North America around 15,000 years ago and migrated into South America around 12,000 years ago. To date, most of the evidence found by archaeologists supports this scenario. But what happens when evidence is found that does not?
If you can imagine that 22,000-year-old dates were controversial, put another 0 on that, and all of a sudden we're coming out with really nice spear points that nowhere else in the world were found at that antiquity. This was a huge problem. So Cynthia really didn't know what was going on. She wondered about the nature of the dates. There are some letters that have survived that discuss this type of quandary that she was in. I recently got a letter from Hal Malde with some incredibly wild uranium dates on the Valsequillo material. I don't see how we can take them seriously since they conflict with the archaeology, with his own geologic correlations, and with a couple of C14 dates. However, God help us, he wants to publish them right away. I'm enclosing a copy of Hal's letter and my reply. Needless to say, any restraint you can exercise on him would be greatly appreciated. All we need to do at this point is to put that stuff in print, and every reputable prehistorian in the country will be rolling in the aisles.
The Valsequillo material seemed to be about 250,000 years old. And when I told Cynthia Irwin Williams about this, she sort of blew her top. She couldn't believe that this was so. I think as a result of that, Cynthia really gave up on the site. We got no feedback from her about anything further about her results, and things really came to a standstill.
As a result of these controversial dates, Cynthia Irwin Williams never returned to Valsequillo. All of her artifacts and most of her field notes have vanished. She never published the final results of her 6 years of fieldwork. Juan Armenta was forbidden to return to the site, and fraudulent confessions were obtained at gunpoint. All his artifacts were confiscated, and his career was ruined. Dr. McIntyre relates what happened to her.
I can still say I'm frustrated because the Hueyatlaco site is so important and it's being totally ignored by the media. And I was rather naive. I thought, okay, we've got something big here, but I'm just going to stick with the date. We've got the information, we got the facts, let's get the facts out and go on from there. And I didn't realize it was going to ruin my whole career.
So which of the three legs is wrong? Some experts in the field believe they have found an explanation that could solve the mystery of the trilemma. Geologists call it an unconformity. Dr. Michael Waters is the director of the Center for the Study of the First Americans. He has worked on more than 50 archaeological field projects and is well known for his expertise in geoarchaeology.
Valsequillo and Hueyatlaco always intrigued me because it was one of the localities that had the possibility of strong evidence for pre-Clovis occupation in the Americas. The first thing I found that when we went down to the site and examined the stratigraphy and mapped it, that we could identify bed eye, and that bed eye definitely went underneath the Hueyatlaco ash. The other thing that we found was that there was a major unconformity between bed eye and the overlying stratigraphy. so there was an inset fill basically into the older sediments, and confirming what Irwin Williams had found. And it was in that layer that additional artifactual material was found. Now the difference between what I found and what was found in 73 is that it was thought that those units that contained the bifacial material went, in addition to the bed eye, also went underneath the Wyatt-Laco ash. But I think that there's a very clear erosional context separating those layers, which have been called the ones that contain the bifacial artifacts, are clearly post-date the Wyatt-Laco ash.
There are two prevailing views to explain the strata above where the artifacts were found. Mike Waters' view says that an ancient river cut down through the successive layers of strata, including the Wyatt-Laco ash, carving a deep trench through all the layers. The artifacts were deposited, and then new sediments were filled in up to the present level. In this scenario, the artifacts are not as old as the ash, and there is no conflict with the current theories of early man in the New World. The alternate view is that the artifacts were left behind in various strata before the volcanic ash overlaid the area. All the subsequent layers of strata, including the Wyatt-Laco ash, were deposited in an unbroken sequence, sealing the artifacts below. This makes any artifact beneath, by necessity, older than the ash. The question is, which model is correct?
So it became very obvious. The thing that had to be done is to go back and dig it again, to analyze all these notions, and especially this idea of the undercutting of the stream.
So the team went back to Mexico in 2001, this time accompanied by Bob McKinney and Sam Van Landingham. Their goal was to see, once and for all, if there was evidence for the stream that Mike says cut through the strata, separating the artifacts from the older ash layer. One way to determine that was to compare the rocks and soil on both sides of the erosional contact, where Mike claims the rock drastically changes.
It's June 15th. Bob McKinney came. He's in the blue.
Bob McKinney received his degree in geology from MIT and has been working with oil and mining companies for the past 40 years. After collecting samples from the site, he returned to Midland, Texas, where the monoliths were stored. Bob examined the monoliths taken from Wyatt-Laco by Roald Frixell in the mid-60s. They preserve a perfect record of the layers of strata directly above where the artifacts were found, inside Mike's purported inset.
This is as if you were to take that whole trench and bring it home with you, but you can't do that. So you take one slice out of the wall of the trench, glue it to a board, and bring that back so you can study it just as it was in the outcrop. So we have this length of stabilized section taken from a trench located about 20 to 25 feet from where the fossil remains were found. There is no question in my mind from a geological point of view that the zone that contains the artifacts was not incised by a more recent stream. And to do this, to prove it to ourselves, we have traced that zone from underneath the overlying tuff bed up to a trench that goes back underneath it, and we followed this bed the entire way, and it is not interrupted, not incised by anything. Therefore, the strata that contain the bifacial tools and together with the bones has not been disturbed at all. The important point here is that the section that we examined is the section in which the fossils were found. It was not eroded, it was not redeposited. Those samples are right, those tools and everything else are right where they started.
Mike Waters doesn't agree and interprets the stratum differently.
But anytime you have a situation where you have something like you're following a contact like this and you've got clay, and then you cross an abrupt contact like this, it's almost vertical or very high angle, and then you go into something that's completely texturally different like a sand, it's telling you that something has happened here. And geologically, you have to evaluate this to determine whether you have an erosional contact there separating them, meaning this is older and this is younger, or is there some sort of relationship here where this is grading into that? And as I say, in '73 they thought this was grading into that, but I think you can very clearly see in this photo that this is a very sharp contact with clay on this side and sands on that side, and that this contact comes up in here where it's been disturbed by vegetation. But very clearly this is younger than that.
Now our interpretation, of course, is entirely different. We see it not in terms of continuity of color, but in continuity of bedding. And therefore we see this as a continuous layer, although changing in texture from sand to clay.
The monoliths Fryxell removed and preserved turned out to be a valuable asset to the investigation. They enabled McKinney to compare thin sections of the rock both inside and outside the inset.
We determined from examination of those thin sections that the rock was the same everywhere we looked at it. Now, had there been an intrusion down into this layer, it would have been evident from one of the samples that we took. So we closed the box.
Since different minerals have different optical properties, most rock-forming minerals can be easily identified.
So I made estimates of the percentage of minerals, and then I looked at the grains themselves to see what they looked like. Were they rounded? Were they angular?
Thin sections were compared from both sides of the purported inset, from within the inset, directly above where the artifacts were found, and outside the inset, under the volcanic ash. If the rock were different, as Mike has claimed, the thin sections would reveal a dramatically different petrology. Upon examination, samples from the two areas, while showing minor differences in grain size, were essentially the same rock, both composed of grains of quartz and feldspar in a matrix. And more significantly, the weathering was the same. If an ancient river had enough energy to carve a deep channel, it would leave telltale evidence of rough weathering compared to the milder sedimentation under the ash. Bob found both areas to be weathered by the milder sedimentary action.
That there is no question in my mind from a geological point of view that the zone that contains the artifacts was not incised by a more recent stream.
In summary, bed I would go underneath the Weyat-Laco ash and therefore be older than the Weyat-Laco ash. How much older? I don't know. Probably not that much older because this sediment package could accumulate very quickly. But this erosional contact indicates very clearly that this postdates all these other older fluvial deposits as well as the Weyat-Laco ash. And so therefore this is younger than the Weyat-Laco ash, the units, what she called beds C and E, that contain the bifacial artifacts.
Did an ancient river carve a channel 11 meters deep through the Weyat-Laco ash and the beds below it, explaining how the artifacts could have been found that deep in the strata? Or did the volcanic airfall of Weyat-Laco ash cover and shroud the man-made artifacts and butchered animal bones just where they were left by ancient hunters over 250,000 years ago? A surprising answer to this crucial question may be found in the single-celled body of one of nature's tiniest creatures. Diatom, any of various minute, unicellular, or colonial algae of the class Bacillariophyceae, having siliceous cell walls consisting of two symmetrical parts. Sam Van Landingham is an environmental geologist from Midland, Texas, whose expertise is using diatoms to date the age of rock strata.
And he can go into a strata, he can take a sample, he can find these little things called diatoms, which are microscopic, and with his 40-some years of experience, he is able to tell which diatom this is, when it existed, and when it didn't.
Some of these diatoms, some of the types that are in here, are still living today. And some of them are not. Some of them died out over 80,000 years ago, and those are the ones that I'm trying to find.
First, we need to know, Sam, what are diatoms?
Diatom is a tiny one-cell microorganism, and it's enclosed in a siliceous or glassy skeleton, and it's highly ornate.
An artifact is dropped on the ground near the edge of a stream. The water level rises, surrounding the artifact with living diatoms. When the diatoms die, they sink to the bottom and become part of the sediment. Over time, the sediment builds and covers the artifact. This process is repeated and new beds are formed, each containing unique communities of diatoms. Long after the water has receded, geologists can determine the age of the various strata by analyzing the diatoms which are present.
Diatoms have been cataloged very carefully since 1850. There's over 26,000 of those species that have been identified.
Diatoms have an extensive fossil record, going back millions of years and existing in various forms through the present day. Some of these amazing microorganisms have a lifespan of only minutes or hours, yet many of the species have remained unchanged for millions of years. Periodically, whole species will die off, never to be seen again in the geologic record. When those species are found in rock strata, it gives a minimum age for that strata. Deep in the ground at Huayatlaco, where all the artifacts were found, hundreds of species of extinct diatoms were discovered, including Navicula cryptocephala and Cimbella cistula. According to Dr. Van Landingham, this means the strata is of Sangamonian age, a minimum of 80,000 years old. He found identical groups of these diatoms both inside and outside of Mike's purported inset. How can this be?
Yeah, Sam does great work. I don't have any problems with diatom work, but the only thing I'm concerned about is redeposition of diatoms from the older deposits into the younger deposits, which is entirely possible. And that's probably exactly what happened. You get redeposition of pollen, you get redeposition of ostracods, you get redeposition of diatoms. So that evidence is very weak compared to the geochronological evidence.
Mike says that the reason the same diatoms were found in both places was because the older ones were washed down and mixed into the newer sediment, an idea that Bob does not agree with.
And I think that is exactly what's probably happening.
But you would have a mixture in that situation.
Well, my problem is I just think they got eroded out of here and redeposited into there.
Bob points out that if the older diatoms were mixed in with the newer sediment, we would expect to find them mixed with some younger diatoms. This, however, is not what Sam found.
If you're going to redeposit material that you're eroding from older beds and deposit it in the younger bed, then you would have a mixture of taxa that belong to both species. In other words, the younger beds would be represented with the taxa that do not exist in the older beds.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not the case. The diatoms that Sam investigated on both sides of that unconformity were all the same age and were not mixed with anything else.
Yeah.
So you didn't have younger material being deposited at the same time as you were eroding the old material.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, as I say, the diatom evidence, I haven't digested it completely. I've seen critiques of the diatom evidence, and there's been some harsh criticisms of the diatom analyses, but I don't want to go into those here.
Now, I told Mike years ago that he better start learning about diatoms, because if he doesn't, it's going to come back and bite him. And he assured me he would. He never did.
Can the identification of diatoms be used with confidence to make scientific determinations? Diatom evidence was the key to solving a 1993 murder case in Switzerland.
And the only forensic evidence introduced in that trial was diatom evidence. Case closed, first-degree murder. And that's the only evidence introduced.
Mike Waters' inset hypothesis requires a rushing stream with enough force to carve a deep channel into the bedrock. As a result of this high-energy activity, diatoms would have been abraded from the older surface and washed down to form the new deposits. Both McKinney and Van Landingham found no evidence of this high-energy erosion. Instead, they found the rock was formed by low-energy erosion from calm lake water type activity. This explains why identical communities of diatoms were found both inside and outside the purported inset, intact and unmixed with any newer diatoms. It also supports what Bob learned from his thin sections, that both sides of the purported inset are the same rock with the same weathering.
There's no inset there. Not through the stratigraphy, not through the thin sections, and not through the diatoms, and any one of which would have been enough. But there's no inset there.
Some have described the enigma at Valsequillo as a trilemma, comprised of archaeology, geochronology, and the theory explaining man's arrival in the New World. With this trilemma, only two of the three legs can be right.
What if we are dealing with something very old?
Well, I really doubt that, because it would mean that you have really well-made bifacial artifacts like this at 1,000,000 years. And you look anywhere in the world at 1,000,000 years, and what are people making? At 1,000,000 years, they're making Oldowan tools, and at best maybe primitive hand axes. And it just would make no anthropological or archaeological sense that people at 1,000,000 years in North America would be making nice bifacial spear points.
Yeah.
And if they had been, then the rest of human evolution should have taken place in the New World, and people should have back migrated into the Old World.
I know very well that Mike's the expert, and I'm not. But on the other hand, I do have a scientific background, and I've looked at a lot of data, which compels me to think that this stuff is old. The next step planned is that everybody go back next spring, dig again, but this time with one single agenda, and that is to determine there's an inset there, yes or no.
5 years elapsed while Marshall Payne continued his efforts to send a team to Hueyatlaco for one last dig. He hoped this final field trip would provide the evidence he needed to either confirm or refute the existence of an inset. This inset hypothesis, proposed by Dr. Mike Waters, was the only obstacle, in Marshall's view, to confirming the ancient dates for the collection of spear points discovered by archaeologist Cynthia Irwin-Williams. The stakes are high, for if validated, these artifacts would be the oldest evidence of modern man ever found in the New World, with the potential to rewrite history. What follows is a record of the surprising events that brought this epic tale to its conclusion.
Yeah, 5 years goes by, and the first year we apply for a permit, no permit. How come no permit? Well, that's Mexico. Next year we apply for a permit, no permit. How come? Well, bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff. Well, this is getting old now. I'm getting where I don't believe this.
You'd put in for the permit, and then they wanted a report. We produced a report, and then there wasn't something in there that they wanted. So, they have their own bureaucracy.
The permit application process is just a routine clerical thing. There is no reason in my mind why we shouldn't have had a permit. So, as far as I'm concerned now, after each year, enough is enough. There's something rotten in Denmark here. Something nasty is going on.
And so as a consequence, I don't think there's anything sinister. I think it's just more of bureaucracy, low priority, and falling through the cracks.
But what we did get was the permit, not until May. Of course, way too late to dig. But now I'm told the permit's good for a year, so there's absolutely nothing on the planet that could possibly prevent the dig.
We did get our permit finally that 1 year, but it was too late to go in the field. The reservoir was up. And then the next year when we're ready to go, there's a drug war raging. And in addition to that, somebody had built walls, going all the way down from that house, slump block walls. They'd planted trees in the old excavation area. There's chain link fence around everything. I mean, they're actually intruding into federal property.
Around March or so, I get 3 photographs. And the 3 photographs are of a house built on the bluff by the site, just above it, and the whole site was landscaped, trees planted, bushes, walls and fences around it. And Mike says, that's it. Can't dig. He's out of patience. He's going to wind this thing up. He already knows enough to finish this thing up, and there wasn't that much evidence we could have got out of a dig anyway.
And really, even if we could have gone back, I mean, it was really unfortunate that we couldn't go back. What could we have really have gotten if we went back? If you would have got lucky and you did some archaeological digging, you might have gotten an artifact in place, perhaps. But there was no way to obtain a geochronological age for that younger material, for the material from way at Laco.
Later I found out that 2 of the specific reasons we didn't have a permit turned out to be not true, just lies. I just didn't believe it. So I sent Neil down to see if anybody that I knew could dig this thing out. It was him. And he proceeded to set up appointments and had his video camera with him, ready to tape the interviews. And he had a couple of very, very eminent archaeologists ready to look right into the camera and say, Marshall got lied to.
I went to Mexico on the behalf of Marshall Payne to find out why permits to excavate Valsequillo had not been forwarded to Mike Waters. I'm a dirt archaeologist. My training was in Mexico. I worked for the Mexican government quite a few years. I was married to Miss Mexico. And so I'm very involved in the culture.
He is a very trusted friend. I know he never exaggerates or lies or anything like that. I knew what he found he would report to me accurately.
I had 4 interviews planned and set up for the strip. Of those 4 interviews, one of my colleagues and one of my best friends died 2 days before I arrived. That was strange enough. But upon arriving with the other 3, I was informed that they were not allowed to give me an interview. I was told, if you had been here a few weeks ago, we could have done the interview, but now I'm prohibited from doing so. In another case, I had set up for an interview, and when I arrive, I find out that he's traveled out of state. So all we could do is communicate by telephone and email, though he readily admitted that all the permits had been given. He was very defensive they hadn't excavated because they couldn't. The 3rd interview simply did not appear, nor could I establish contact. The 4 that I planned that had agreed to meet with me, 1 had died, and the other 3 had stonewalled in one way or another. These people have been ordered not to grant me an interview.
Who would benefit from this cover-up? The cover-up was so obvious.
I had several phone calls, but one phone call was far stranger than all the others. I answer, hello, how are you? I'm fine. Where are you? I said, I'm in Puebla. To whom am I speaking? A friend of a friend. Have you investigated Mario's death? I haven't finished that investigation yet, but I'll be glad to tell you the results if you give me your telephone number. Well, they didn't fall for that. He said, I will call you back. He said, they know who you are, where you are, and when you're going to leave. I said, fine. Who are they? And he said, you know who they are.
Well, all I can say is you've got to realize how high up this had to come from. So in my mind, Mexicans had nothing to do with squashing this stuff. Somebody didn't want that dig dug.
Even though Neil hit a wall of silence in his investigation of the permits, he did make an important discovery that could shed light on a 40-year-old mystery.
For years, people have asked the question, where are Cynthia's artifacts? Where are the artifacts from Valsequillo?
She was working under a permit that these artifacts belonged to the Museo Nacional in Mexico City, where some of them worked. And so when she left, she deposited these along with the bone at the museum. And when she went back to study them, they were all gone. They've never been seen since.
I think I have finally resolved that issue. We have replicas of the artifacts. They're in the Smithsonian. But what about the originals? You see, Lorenzo had confiscated them. He had them in a showcase. There are many witnesses who saw them in that showcase, and they were proclaimed at being 35,000 years old. In the '84 earthquake in Mexico City, that building collapsed. And when they shoveled it out, of course, it had been also a warehouse, there were artifacts scattered everywhere. And they were simply scooped up into boxes and put into boxes. And if you can imagine the old Indiana Jones warehouse that you see in the movies, this is the kind of warehouse with shelves collapsing, artifacts spilled everywhere. They're just picked up, they're put in mass, they're cleaning up, they're going to have to tear this building out. And they're mixed. And all those artifacts were shipped to another warehouse. It's a warehouse that is on no street, has no address, has no signs on the front. And to get to the building, you have to drive and jump the curve, drive across grass, and arrive at the warehouse, which has no name on it. It's openly hidden. Nobody would know it's there. There is no access. Very interesting place. I made friends with the warehouseman, and he said, sure, come anytime. And when I arrived, he said, Neil, who have you been talking to? I said, nobody. Why? He said, the authorities want to come and shut you down. They do not want you looking for those artifacts. Needless to say, arrangements were made, and we searched. However, the next day, the warehouse was full of hierarchy looking for me, wanting to see what I had looked at. The only people that knew of that trip was that warehouseman and an American. And I believe that the American had to have tipped off authorities to create a great concern on their behalf. And you know, ironically, we are looking for very possibly the most important artifacts in the world. And where are they? They're in an unnamed, unaddressed, undesignated warehouse where they are mixed in with millions of other artifacts among thousands of boxes. And nobody with the tenacity to sort through it. And how convenient, because there's a lot of people who don't want to sort through it.
When you have breakthroughs in science, any science, like I'm purporting happened to Valsequillo, a lot of people suffer. The first thing they got is peer problems, and the second thing they got is funding problems, and the third thing they might be looking for is another job.
Leakey goes to Africa and demonstrates that man's over 1 million years old. And he's a hero. He's cited in all the textbooks. And then he goes to the Calico site in California. And there he demonstrates man to be 200,000 years old. He's laughed off the stage.
I keep remembering the story that George Carter told me many years ago. When he got out of college, his first job was as a curator or such at the Museum of Man in San Diego, where he's from. And things are going along okay, and he told me that one day at lunch he stood up and announced that he had some pretty darn good evidence that man was in the Western Hemisphere 50,000 years ago. Shortly after that, George was looking for another job. He got his butt fired. Fired. This is what I'm talking about when I mention the dark side of archaeology. This is kid stuff, but kids with power.
Finally, he wrote me, he says, oh, well, we can't do your article on Weyatlaco because the manuscript got lost. It fell down behind the file cabinet.
Before the finding of Clovis man, we believe that man is in the Americas several thousand years ago. And we have the breakthrough of Clovis, of the Clovis finds, and all of a sudden we have man stretching back into time 10,000 years before that. This is simply another breakthrough. All of a sudden now we push it back, but it's a big one. 400,000 years.
Now, are these artifacts that old? We don't know. So it's real important to go down and find out, because if they are that old, then that's going to change the picture of the evolution of humanity throughout the whole world.
That leaves us with the possibility of humans being in the Western Hemisphere 400,000 years ago. One guy at the Smithsonian asked me one time, he says, well, if they've been here that long, where's all the corroborating evidence? Where's the pottery and all that kind of stuff and the tools? And my reaction was, well, if you'll dig down 10 feet to look for something 10,000 years ago, when's the next time you're going to dig down 400 feet to find something that was 400,000 years ago?
In Indonesia, we have the Hobbit people, 3 foot tall, 800,000 years. I mean, these dates are not unheard of. They're simply ignored.
I want to remind you of the Cactus Hill site in Virginia, where the man digging with a crew was looking for a Clovis site, and by God, he found it. And that should have satisfied him, and it did. And it just dawned on him, well, we're right here, why not dig a little further? And he did. And he found pre-Clovis artifacts. Never would have looked a couple of years before that. Wouldn't have thought about it. Look at the Göbekli Tepe site in southeastern Turkey, dated 11,500 years ago by the German archaeologists. Nobody doubts the date. There are times for a number of major glaciations whereby people could walk from Siberia over to Alaska and then down to Weyatlaco. If a major glaciation 12,000 years ago allowed purportedly the Clovis people to walk across from Asia to Alaska and then south, why not other earlier major glaciations allowing people to do the same thing? Plenty of opportunities for that to have happened. And now that archaeology is beginning to realize that Homo erectus was capable of things they never thought they were capable of, why not look at Weyatlaco and say, gee, maybe they were here 400,000 years ago, and like Cactus Hill, if we use that thinking, we'll discover all kinds of things that we never thought were possible before. But let me talk a little about, to me, was the turning point in my own feelings on what's going on down there. Because I went along with it, and I went along with it. But one time, Mike said this to me. It's virtually verbatim. He said, Marshall, I don't care what the evidence is. I cannot believe the old dates. Because they refute everything that's known about archaeology and anthropology. He says, I could never bring myself to believe those old dates. Well, I don't know where he learned his science, but it sure is totally different from where I learned my science. to say I'm not going to believe anything regardless of what the evidence is probably the most anti-scientific statement I've ever heard in my life. If the scientists didn't understand that they got to stop with their old beliefs and follow the evidence, where would progress ever come from in the last 5,000 years of science as we think of it? It wouldn't be there. I got into this thing 14 years ago thinking I'd spend 2 or 3 months and, maybe $1,000 or so. It turned out to be 14 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I want the viewer to understand that I never did and never will expect $1 return for that.
We know that early man made these artifacts, but we don't know when. Different tests have given a range of ages from 35,000 years to as much as 500,000 years. The science behind all the tests seems to agree that they are at least older than the 12,000 years deemed possible by conventionally accepted theory.
I can't claim to have proof, but I can claim to have very strong evidence. And the evidence is strong enough to suggest that in the future, those looking at early man consider this evidence that people were maybe here 400,000 years ago, not 12 or 20,000 years ago. So the evidence ought to speak for itself. You've got a case here of evidence versus belief. My hope is that the belief will be set aside and people will just look at the evidence. And it may very possibly lead to exciting discoveries about the history of man. Isn't that archaeology's job?